Welcome to the Frequently Asked Questions video series by Amaana Consulting. My name is Kieran Smith, and I'm the principal and owner. One of the key challenges facing smaller, community-based nonprofits is access to adequate and consistent capital to run their organizations. This video explores some, not all, of the barriers to accessing capital that we have observed in our work with smaller nonprofits. First, one of the challenges and contributing factors is proximity to and relationship with funders. Many smaller nonprofits don't already have these established relationships, and I think this is one of the challenges that is more commonly known within the nonprofit sector. But if we dive a bit deeper, we find that there are misperceptions about the norms and mechanisms of capital in the nonprofit sector. So, charitable organizations, particularly private foundations and donor-advised funds, have historically existed primarily as wealth preservation and tax sheltering vehicles. This is something we need to understand if we're going to have clarity on how capital moves in this space. Here's a brief video that speaks to this issue and its impact on philanthropic giving.
Donor-advised funds are this kudzu that's eating up the world of charitable giving. I'm Alan Cantor. I've developed a peculiar expertise in donor-advised funds. Donor-advised funds are these entities that live in a gray zone in between private foundations and regular, what we think of as public charities. And it provides them with a lot of tax advantages and a lot of flexibility. You'd have to go back to 1969 to understand how donor-advised funds developed. So Congress in the 1969 Tax Act said there are two kinds of charities. There's public charities, a soup kitchen or a school or a hospital. We trust them, and they can do kind of what they want. And there are private foundations, and we're going to watch them like a hawk, like the Ford Foundation or the Rockefeller Foundation. They developed a lot of rules specifically for private foundations. A, we have to know everything that happens. There has to be full transparency. B, you have to give out at least 5% of your assets every year to actual public charities. C, you're going to have a lower tax advantage. So what's happened in the 50 years since is that donor-advised funds have grown into this strange hybrid. They give the donors essentially the kind of control they would have in a private foundation, with none of the transparency and none of the requirements for distribution. Donor-advised funds are really attractive to donors. They can get their full charitable deduction upfront, but there's no requirement that they ever have to give the money out in a given year or ever. We're losing the charitable giving of some of the people who are most capable of giving large gifts because it's going into these entities and it's staying there. So let's imagine that you're a donor and you bought a house on Lake Tahoe in 1962 for $100,000. It's now worth $5 million. And you want to create a charitable entity that you can make charitable gifts from. If you put that into a private foundation, the only tax deduction you would get would be the $100,000 that you paid for over 50 years ago. If you put it into a donor-advised fund, you would actually get a $5 million charitable deduction because it's considered part of the public charity that technically controls the donor-advised fund. 95, 98, 99% of donor-advised fund donors are good people who are making grants in a good way, but there are people who are using this to hide their identity and to fund controversial causes. There's more and more money going into donor-advised funds. There's less and less money going to soup kitchens, boys and girls clubs, hospitals, schools, places that are actually providing services. I've worked my whole career in the nonprofit world, and we need to acknowledge that there's a power imbalance. There are the organizations that need money, and there are the individuals and institutions that have money. And right now, nonprofits are grinding their teeth because they are really concerned about the growth and lack of regulation around donor-advised funds, but they are reluctant to speak up because they don't want to bite the hand that feeds them.
So, with that backdrop and the understanding that The available funding for all charitable organizations is shrinking. And of course, the availability of funding for minority-led and smaller organizations is that much more acute. What else do we need to know about how philanthropic dollars are flowing or not flowing in the nonprofit sector? So, taking a deeper look at the makeup of philanthropic organizations, we find that 90% of US foundations do not have websites. Open funding opportunities via requests for proposals or RFPs make up less than 1% of total foundation funding. These foundations do not offer publicly advertised grant opportunities. They pick and choose whom and what they want to fund, typically by invitation only. In effect, the vast majority of charitable funding from these foundations is not available to organizations that are not already connected to the funders. There's another barrier, in my view, to consider. That is an overemphasis on securing grant funding for operating revenue. Nationally, 80% of nonprofit revenue is derived from fee-for-service and government contracts, not grants. Black-led organizations are underrepresented in state and federal contracting. So that's an issue. But the vast majority of funding on a national level is still not coming from grant funding for operating dollars. Let's look at the state level. Here in Maryland, the figure is greater than 70%, with only 13% of revenue derived from charitable contributions from foundations and corporations. And so what I've observed in working with a number of organizations is that the vast majority of the funding that they are targeting is grant funding. There's an imbalance here, and a perception that the grant funding is going to be a substantial portion of the revenue needed, when in fact the norms in the nonprofit sector are for grant funding to be a very small portion of revenue. So where are charitable contributions coming from? Drilling down a bit further, of the $427 billion in charitable giving in 2019, 68% of those funds came from individuals. And that is significant, because there is a perception in some communities that the vast majority of that charitable giving is coming from corporations and foundations, which is not actually the case. The charitable gifts are coming from individuals, and so the amount of attention and effort that is directed at grant seeking is not matched by the amount of attention and effort that is directed at attracting and cultivating individual donors. I share this information to address common misperceptions about philanthropy and nonprofit finance, how money is flowing, and where the vast majority of nonprofit revenue is derived. Many nonprofit organizations that have access to capital through financial institutions and financial products. They have lines of credit, credit cards, and loans they can use for cash flow management and to help them weather storms that smaller, particularly minority-led organizations often have difficulty weathering. Access to and use of capital in the form of credit is built into the models that you will find in nonprofit financial planning and management. The models assume that an organization will carry some debt, have reserves, or both. For many grassroots and minority-led organizations, these resources are not available. They function completely outside of this paradigm. During a recent workshop, a client mentioned that some folks in some communities feel guilty for seeking compensation for the charitable work that they do. They feel that their work should be altruistic. They don't even think to ask to be compensated. They are eating costs either out of their own pocket or time or both, because that is their orientation to the work. While there's nothing wrong with having an altruistic philosophy when it comes to charitable work, it does become problematic when you're talking about operating, sustaining, and growing a corporate entity, which is what tax-exempt nonprofits are. They are corporate entities subject to regulatory requirements to maintain charitable status. This is where the disconnect comes in, because resources are needed to operate and maintain a corporation. There is a bona fide need to adequately resource your organization. It is my hope that this reflection provides a deeper dive into some of the issues impacting access to capital for small, grassroots, and minority-led organizations. If there are other topics you are interested in seeing us cover, please let us know by scanning the QR code on the screen. My name is Kieran Smith. Thank you for tuning in for this episode of our Frequently Asked Questions series.